that'll start us. Thank you.
It's a real quick one.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah, so just haere mai, we can do it together, people.
Tamari e tātou, nau mai haere mai ki tō tātou kaupapa i tēnei ata. Ka whakatūwhera tō tātou kaupapa ki tēnei karikea. Mauri tū, mauri ora ki te whaiao, mauri ora ki te taiao, mauri ora ki tātou katoa, ti hei mauri ora. Haumi e hui e, tai ki e.
Okay. Ko wai au, e te taha o te papa. Ko taranaki te mauna, ko Tokomaru te waka, ko Waicha te awa, ko te ati awa te iwi. Ko Ngāti Rāhiri te hapu, ko Auwai te marae. Ko Stewart, Rātu, ko Hollis, ko Larson, ko Friend. Oku ingoa whānau, ko Rochelle, Stewart Withers, toko ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So welcome everyone. My name's Associate Professor Rochelle Stewart Withers, and you're all here with us today so we can actually talk about this idea of decolonising sport for development and peace, and thinking about what some of the opportunities and challenges might be. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our panellists. And so we've got one of our panellists on the virtual as well. The joys of being a working parent and having a sick child has meant that Holly can't be with us in person, but, in terms of being with us, her presence and stuff like that, she's still with us in the room. So I'll give a quick introduction to our four speakers and just a little brief cap of what we're going to be doing. So this panel discusses over the next 75 minutes how sport for development and peace can be decolonised. So what are some of the opportunities and challenges from the perspective of Indigenous people, and what is the role of the accomplice? And we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of Indigenous people in this space. So our panellists will speak from their positionality as Indigenous or non-Indigenous persons, and in terms of the areas of knowing, for example, as athletes, or as people who are working in the sport policy space, or people who are working in the development space. Four speakers. We've got Dr. Jeremy Hapara. Jeremy's from Otago University, and he's part of the Marsden project with myself and Farah, where we're talking about our game by our rules, bringing an Indigenous perspective to sport for development. And Jeremy is a sport-focused and Indigenous scholar, is co-director of Otago's soon-to-be-opened Indigenous Science Centre, and he's an ex-professional athlete. We then will move to Professor Holly Thorpe. So Holly's based at Waikato. She's a sports sociologist and feminist scholar. She's just recently been awarded, similar to the award that Regina Scavens got a year or so ago, very prestigious James Cook Fellowship. And she writes hugely in the sport for development space as well. And then we'll be moving to Justin Richards. So we're going to hop along the panel a bit as well in terms of the questions that we ask. We're going, so Justin Richards, Associate Professor with Victoria University, and he's also a Senior Evaluation Advisor at Sport New Zealand, Aotearoa. And he writes quite a lot about physical activity and well-being, and he's also a scholar in the sport for development space. And then lastly, we've got Professor Farah Palmer from Massey University. She's a sport-focused feminist, Indigenous scholar and ex-professional athlete. Many of you will be familiar with Farah's name as having captained the New Zealand women's rugby Black Ferns team to numerous World Cup wins, and she's the first ever female board member of the New Zealand Rugby Union. So if we could just give a bit of a round of applause to our panel. And so look, there's going to be a fairly kind of relaxed kind of approach to this wānanga or this hui, and we really want to have time at the end, so we're going to make sure that we're flagged about 20 minutes out or even more, so that we can have some conversations with the audience and questions can be asked, because it's actually the questions where often the magic actually happens in terms of the conversations. And so, yeah, I think one of the things that we're really keen to understand is, so Paul Whirinui talks about the idea of decolonising sports sociology, and he talks about this idea that it actually has to move from being a noun to being a verb. So we actually need people doing things. And we often talk as Indigenous scholars that it's not just our responsibility to do this mahi, that there's a clear space for non-Indigenous people to be actually working with us, getting down and I suppose getting dirty and doing actually the really hard work that has to be done so that we can actually bring about change. And so I'm going to move to Jeremy first. We've got a few questions that we'll pose, but things around what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, what do people see to be the key priorities in terms of a decolonising agenda, in terms of sport for development. And I think, Jeremy, you'll kick us off and then we'll just see how things evolve.
O tira tēnā tātou katoa, ai ko waio no hea hau, ko tainui te waka, ko ngā tirau kaua te au ki te tonga te iwi, ko ngā ti parerau kaua raua ko ngā ti hui a oku hapu. Ai, no taitoko raua ko te awahau ahau, no reira, ai, he uri tēnei no ngā tirau kaua ki te tonga. So, hi everyone, I'm Jeremy, and I just wanted to, chat, first open up with who I am and where I'm from. So I'm from a little settlement in the hora whenua called Foxton Beach, where the Manawatu awa meets the Moana. So that's kind of where I was born and raised, and I just acknowledged my iwi back home. So as part of that, ko tēnei te mihi nui ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohe, Ngāti Whātua ki o Rākei, nō reira kei te mihi, to Ngāti Whātua, the local iwi here, whose lands that we're on and gathered on today. So quick mihi to them as well, in terms of their mana as mana whenua. And I guess that's where I want to start off, There's this idea of whenua as mana whenua, and how we might conceptualise, or how we might think about sport for development from a mana whenua lens. And as part of that kōrero, ko wai au, there is no au without whānau, all right? You never stand alone. From a Te Ao Māori perspective, I'm not here without the family behind me, and those that came before me, and those who will come after me. So, we're kind of always thinking as Māori in a moment that is kind of blurry in terms of temporality. The past is the present is the future, all at the same time. So when we think about whānau, hapu and iwi, those three kind of words there capture all those moments, Because when you're hapu, that's the next generation coming through, and your iwi are the bones that you stand on, your ancestors. So there's always this idea of, I'm standing here today in the present, but I just acknowledge that those whose shoulders that I'm standing on, as well as those who will follow in our footsteps, for people who have blazed some trails like Farah and Rochelle, etc., in this sport for development space. What's the challenge? I think for me personally, as Māori, as mana whenua, the idea of this sport-only idea is a really interesting idea from a Māori perspective. The idea of just doing sport for the sheer benefits that sport brings alone within sport, and it's a really I find that idea challenging in terms of, I think Māori always did. There was always a reason behind anything they did, whether it was a plus sport focus or a sport plus focus. It was never just, I'm going to get up and go for a run because that's going to make me feel good. You know, in terms of I think about our hunters and gatherers who gathered kai, who went diving for kai moana, or who, went hunting for wildlife. There was a purpose to it, eh? And our purpose was to sustain our livelihoods, really, and to feed people, eh? So there was always a method to our madness, so to speak. There was always a point to something we did. We didn't just jump up and go for a run for the physiological benefits of exercise. There was a kaupapa behind whatever activity we were engaged in. And so when I think about sport for development and peace, for example, traditionally, we used physical activity, games, traditional taonga tukiho like kiorahi, for example. Kiorahi was a game that used to try and bring about peace for neighbours who had some territory wars, right, around boundaries and tribal boundaries. There were a couple of decisions we could make. Yeah, we could potentially go to war and battle each other, and fight over this territorial boundary, or we can try and settle this peacefully. And a game like kiorahi was one of those mechanisms that we use to kind of, winner takes all, pink slips kind of deal, We're going to play this game, traditional taonga tukuiho, kiorahi, and we'll let that settle it, which was a lot more of a peaceful way to reconcile this idea of a territorial boundary than just beating each other up, which kind of like, I look at Whara there with their arm in a sling, and I think about modern day sport and just battering our bodies in modern day sport and beating each other up for sometimes what's the point, if it's just for the sake of competitiveness and competition, then I don't know if that's a train of thought that kind of Māori bought into traditionally.
Cool. So thanks for that, Jeremy. So a key point you've raised there is that for many Indigenous populations, how we conceptualise of sport, or how sport has been used traditionally, or how it's even conceived of now, can sometimes be a little bit different, perhaps in terms of how non-Indigenous people think about sport. So I'm just going to move to you now, Holly, and see if you've got any ideas to add in terms of, what do you see to be some of the challenges for decolonising of the kind of sport for development space or sport for social change? Thanks. And I hope you're hearing us well.
I am. Kia ora. Thanks, Rochelle. I tepu aki o ki Taronganui a Kiwa. Kei te mihi o ki ngā iwi o Kone. Kei te mahi o ki te wharewananga o Waikato. Kei te mihi o ki te iwi o Kona. Ko Jeff Rawa, ko Chris o Kumatua, ko Jose tōku manua, ko Carlos Rawa, ko Bella Aku Tamariki, ko Hollythorpe tōku ingoa. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. There's so much here to pick up on, and obviously I'm a Pākehā, and I'm also a feminist, and as a feminist I'm always interested in the workings of power and thinking about ethics and responsibility and vulnerabilities in our research and privilege, and so unpacking the privilege that I bring, institutional privilege, into any research space or sport for development and peace space. And a little bit of background, I guess, might help in terms of my interest coming to the sport for development and peace space was really looking at informal sports that young people in different parts of the world were choosing themselves, and then developing those for their communities. So it was always whether it was parkour in Gaza, for example, or the young people in Christchurch after earthquakes and the activities that they picked up to kind of, and how they used, whether it was skateboarding or mountain biking or climbing and things like that to help them in their communities through that recovery process. So I've always been interested in the activities that people in local environments and communities choose for themselves. And so that's kind of brought with it a bit of a critique of some of these assumptions in SDP kind of work, where often it is, for a long time, it's been white researchers from the global north going to these exotic other places, often in the global south, with these ideas of what sport is and presenting these and then, kind of offering them as the solution to local people's problems. And we've come a long way from there, but I think there's still some quite deeply embedded assumptions in a lot of SDP work, which is researchers from the global north and people offering programs from the global north going to countries elsewhere and offering sport as a solution. And I think we've got to unpack that. We've still got lots of work to unpack that, the privilege and the politics and the workings of power and knowledge in that kind of work, whether it's the doing of SDP or the doing of SDP related research. Last year I co-authored a book, I'm showing you here, Sport, Gender and Development, and this was with Lindsay Hayhurst and Megan Chabonsky, and we in here try to spend a lot of time unpacking, sort of working with reflexivity and trying to unpack our positionality and some of our own sort of assumptions, our own positions of privilege and power, and how we've tried to navigate those in the research. In this book, the research comes from, or it's done in Afghanistan, India, Uganda, Nicaragua. So obviously we've got a lot to unpack there in terms of our research and our co-participatory methods. But as an accomplice, I would say the work I'm trying to do more now more than ever, is really to support and amplify Māori, Indigenous, Pacifica, emerging researchers so that they can be the next generation leading this work. Their voices are the most important, their knowledge is so critical to the future of SDP and the process of, and the doing of the decolonisation of sport for development and peace as practice and praxis and pedagogy and in our research.
Thanks for that, Holly. And just to pick up on something that you said, and it came through in a conversation we had yesterday where we were with a group of, in a session where we were talking about racism in development, and one of the things that kind of came out in that was that often some of the people that are sitting in the global south are seen to not have the capacity or the capability to be able to kind of lead projects or do the things that are needed for donors or whatever. And I think you touch on a really important point, is how is it that those of us in position of power and who have had privilege nurture and support and be generous. So we often tell a story about a conversation that Jeremy had with Professor Linda Smith, and he went to her and he said to her, Linda, there's one thing that you could tell me about, what can I do moving forward as an academic? And she said, be generous. And so the idea that it's really important for us who have had opportunity to actually be generous, and particularly with our emerging Indigenous Pacific scholars and things like that. So I think that's a really, really interesting point. I'm just going to move now on to Justin there. And so if you could actually tell us a little bit about what you see some of the challenges to be, Justin, in terms of, and I think we can hear clearly here.
You don't name it, I think.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Kia ora, Rochelle, kia ora koutou. Ko Munga, ko Narangta Awa, ko Richards McPherson, toku whānau, ko Justin toku inua. No Aotearoa toku whānau, no Madribar Australia hau, ki te noho o ki Petone. tēnā koutou katoa. So a little bit about me. I have an Australian accent soon. I'm doing my best. Still, I'm doing my best to lose that. I was brought up in a place called Madrabar, which means place of sticky dirt in the language of the local custodians of the land on which I grew up in Australia. It's on the Gold Coast in southeast Queensland. It was, Madrabar is overshadowed by Springbrook Mountain, which is a really important part of my life. Whenever I go back to visit my parents, it's an important part of my time there, whether I'm there for a day or a week. There's always a bike ride to the top of Springbrook, which is part of that. And the Narang River flows out of Springbrook, which is also an important part of where I grew up. But I've always identified as being from New Zealand, and my parents and my mother's always reminded me of that. And I managed to get a gig back at Sport New Zealand 5 years ago, and I'm not going anywhere. Now I'm back here, so I've really loved being here and enjoying everything about it down in Wellington. But it's great to be part of the panel today, and just reflecting on a couple of things that have already been said. Jeremy said there's always a reason, a purpose behind what we did. And that for me, and Holly came out with this idea of going from the global north to the global south with ideas, projects, solutions, or what I would like to think is the what. And one of the big reflections for me, and one of the things I've learned a lot since being here in Aotearoa is Mornali Reihania, who was the Tuihotu at Sport New Zealand in Aotearoa. She joined the organisation a couple of weeks after I did, and we bonded really closely over many Friday night wines and other times together. But I learned a lot from her, and one of the things that she really taught me is that us Pakeha, the way we think about the world, when we're thinking about investment or programming or projects or interventions, and that's a loaded word, particularly in Australia, is that we start with the what. What are we going to do? And then we move on to the how, and then we think, oh, who do we need? And then the last thing we do is, oh, why are we actually doing this? And that's driven a lot by the funding agencies that we work with, because we've got to go and do the what from the global north to global south, with our idea, our solution, that we're going to go do this sort of thing. And what Mornali taught me was the idea of slowing down and starting with the why, starting with the purpose that Jeremy was talking about, and really exploring that, and getting that really clear. And then from there, you go, so it's the exact opposite order. You go to the who, because actually, who do we need to be part of this for us to achieve our why, to achieve our purpose. And it's only after that that you move to the how, and actually the how and the what become quite easy once you've figured it out and you're all on the same page. And the thing about it is that we're so rushed all the time in our organisations and in our colonised organisations to get to the what are we going to do, what impact are we going to have, how are we going to measure that we don't necessarily slow down and go, actually, we just pull back a bit, a lot of that stuff looks after itself down the track. And that's probably the biggest thing, I think, is the challenge for us in terms of shifting the way we work and the way we operate, the way we invest, the way we think about programs and projects, is coming back to starting with that why and taking the time to do it, and putting up, saying we need more time when the pressures are on, but actually we need more time because we've got to get on the same page here and understand our common purpose. So that's probably some reflections from me.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So basically, really kind of flipping what we're doing, and there's been a lot of conversations about flipping the narrative, or flipping the start point, or flipping who holds the power, those sorts of things. So yeah, that really kind of speaks nicely to that. I'm just going to move on now to Farah, and then if you could tell us what you think some of those challenges might be, and then we'll kind of move back to the panel again, thinking about opportunities, priorities, and then what does it actually mean to be an accomplice, which Holly's already touched a little bit on, and what do we think accomplices look like as Indigenous people. So Farah.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I was talking to a colleague about belonging, and he's a guru when it comes to Māori language, and he said in Māoridom we don't really think about belonging in the same way as perhaps other groups. So he said it's about where are you from and who are you from. So I'm going to start with my kind of where I'm from and who I come from. So ki te taha o tōku karaua, ko rangi whāpimanga, pine ki te awa, ko te koraha te marae, ko Ngāti Mahuta te hapū, ko Waikato te iwi, ki te tāko o tōku kuia, ko Hirangi te maunga, ko Mokau te awa, ko Mokau Kohunui te marae, ko Ngāti Waiora te hapū, ko Ngāti Mahuta te iwi, ko Tainu te waka, ko Whararangi ko Pānga. So I shared with you where I'm from on my grandfather's side and my grandmother's side on my maternal side, which is my Māori side. And that's my sense of belonging because I grew up in the first 7 years of my life with my Māori grandparents and my Māori mum. So I've kind of got that kind of like grounding in a Māori world. However, when I was 7, I was introduced to my Pākehā dad, and we moved to a farm, away from my cousins, away from my Māori community, in a very isolating Pākehā world. That felt very strange to me initially, but made me realise that for the rest of my life I'll be living in 2 worlds. I'll have a Māori kind of concept of who I am, but I've also got this Pākehā side of who I am. So it's interesting for me that I feel like I'm constantly navigating those 2 parts of who I am. So when I was asked about this question, it's been interesting for me that I've decided to create a career in academia but also in rugby. Rugby, a colonised sport that has come to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that Māori have pretty much adopted from a very, very early part of our history. So I don't know if people know, but in 1888, 89, there was the native rugby team, which was an entrepreneur decided they could make money from taking the natives from New Zealand and taking them to the Northern Hemisphere and seeing that they could make a profit. So they got together a whole bunch of people who were iwi and hapu, that's probably how they identified themselves at that stage. Not enough though, so they found 4 people who looked Māori and put them on the team, and they went up north, and that was really the first time that the rugby team wore black jerseys, first time they did haka, first time they played the style that we've now come to know as a New Zealand way of playing, and wore sort of furs. So all of that, from a very early part of our history, Māori have had a strong identification with rugby. Rugby was also something my father was really passionate about, played 54 games for King Country. So as a Pākehā man, I felt connected to that as well. So for some reason, went down to Otago University, discovered that women could play rugby, and kind of went on this path. However, from a very young age, I've had this sense of my why, which was to make a difference. Sounds really corny, but that's what I wanted to do, make a difference to people that mattered to me, and at that time it was Māori and women. So how do I do something that's going to make a difference? Really cheesy kind of thing to think, but that's what I wanted to do. So I started doing that first of all as an athlete. I managed to make it into the New Zealand women's rugby team through possibly luck, chance, good timing, determination, all those things. And so as an athlete, I tried to figure out how I could use this sport and use my profile to try and bring about the decolonisation of how people saw Māori, but also how people saw women. So I did that, and then I retired, and then I thought, now what? So I tried lots of different things. I tried going in media, I was hopeless at it, wasn't really my thing. I tried coaching, I did that for 2 years, and then realised I wasn't great at coaching either, and didn't feel enthusiasm about how I could use this as a decolonising thing. Then I tried to get into management, did that for a little bit, but I found my place, and then of course I became an academic, so I was doing research at the same time as well. Then I found governance, and governance to me is my place where I feel I can make a difference. It's not for everybody, it can be frustrating for people who like to move quickly, but I love the collective decision making that happens in governance, and I also have my experience in sport that I can draw on. So I've been in that kind of rugby governance space, but also more recently in Sport New Zealand, and it's been interesting for me to see how we've gone through this decolonising process in both of these organisations. I would say that rugby is far behind Sport New Zealand in terms of the decolonising. I don't think we have a tiriti or waitangi policy in New Zealand rugby at this stage. We have a Māori Rugby Board, which has been quite tokenistic, kind of a board on the side. We are trying to gain more traction and decolonise from that perspective. And then in Sport New Zealand, we did start off with the 3 Ps, which is a very, very basic understanding of the treaty: participation, partnership and protection. We've moved on from that, and we now have a Māori outcomes framework, which is much more intricate, and that is designed to try and decolonise what we're doing in that sport space. So Jeremy talked about kiwarahi. We're saying, and for me, you mentioned Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and Hingangaroa Smith, who have decolonising methodologies, but that started off as a practice. That started off as how can we decolonise practice, and then it's become a research kind of approach. So in rugby and in Sport New Zealand, what can we do to create things that are for Māori, by Māori, with Māori? And that's what we're starting to do in rugby. What do we do by Māori, for Māori, with Māori? So that it's not something we say, here's something and run with it. Now, the last thing we're going to finish on is that the Rugby World Cup, if people watch that, I think was a really good example of that journey that rugby's going through. So initially, we had a really passionate team, that organising committee. They were like, they had a deadline. This is where the tournament's happening and we need to do things. And they were like, okay, how do we get Māori Pacifica communities engaged? And they will rush. And we just told them to slow down, make sure you connect with the right people in your communities, up in Whangarei, the tangata whenua in Whangarei, and here in Tamaki Makaurau. And they did, they listened to us, and they took a breath and they slowed down. As a result, if you did watch the tournament, there was this genuine engagement with tangata whenua. There was consultation with Hini Wiki Mohi about what can we do in an authentic way. The poi was very, what was kind of decided as something that everyone could do. It was very much from an integrated approach. We had the Pātea Māori Club, we had a whole lot of engagement. So I just think we're on a journey in that organisational sense of what it means to decolonise sport, and some organisations are much more advanced than others.
Cool, thanks, Sarah. So yeah, key points that you're kind of talking about there is this idea of kind of slowing down, building relationships, building connections, and kind of working in a manner that's more authentic. I think key points that you're talking to, and kind of finding your space, I suppose, in terms of what you're good at in relation to, say, governance or whatever, and talking about that praxis and that research and making sure that it's actually underpinned by those values that resonate with Indigenous populations. So yeah, thanks for that. Interesting points being made there. So okay, I'm just going to move back to Jeremy. If you could kind of, the next couple of minutes, tell us about what you think are some of the key priorities in terms of decolonising sport for development and peace, or the sports sociology space, etc. Jeremy.
Just before I do that, talk about those priorities, I just want to kind of acknowledge where I was in that thought process that Farah just shared around her timeline and where I fit into that. Actually, I think I was a postgrad student of hers who she was developing into what I was one of her projects, one of her pet projects. I think early on, she threw me the hospital pass when she got sick of Hoha coaching and said to me, "You're coaching the Massey women's team," and passed me a few typical front row hospital passes earlier in my development. So ngā mihi for that, Farah. And yeah, in terms of tautoko anō ngā mihi ko mihi ake, around the whole idea around kaupapa Māori theory, right? Is it actually, before it was a theory, it was a practice, and Holly referred to that too, around just doing it, getting it done. Recently, I was as part of my role on a governance board, another person volunteered me to be on that, so I'm on the board at Sport Manawatu as well. And we're involved in this kōrero with iwi and stakeholders around their priorities and what they wanted us to do as an organisation. And one of the kaumātua from our mana whenua from Rangitane said to me, just get on with it. Just stop talking about it and do it. And I guess that's what Linda and Graham did too, with kaupapa Māori as well. As a practice, they just got on with it. And they couldn't wait for that process of what Justin was articulating previously of, let's first line up the what and the how, and then we'll go to the who and the why, is they cut straight to the why. Why are we doing this? Let's just do it. And that, for me, is the priority. For our communities, they're saying to us, just bloody do it. Enough hui, enough kōrero, just start doing it, and then the rest will follow. And when I think about sport for development, and sport for development and peace, it's kind of catching up to what we've always done. We've been doing this stuff for a long time now, for centuries. And, someone theorised it about 20 odd years ago. And it takes me back to, when I think about when I was doing my masters, and Para was my masters supervisor, the program that I was doing my masters at was a Tā Mason jury conceived program called Tutoa. And Tutoa had a vision, they had a dream, and then they did it. They just did it. And that was a priority for them. They started off with 9 kids. Most of them had a surname called Jury. And then they wanted, because they'd had enough. They'd been fed up with the education system, the health system, all these other systems that weren't delivering for Māori, and went, well, we're going to create our own school then, which privileges being Māori, which privileges their health and well-being, and ultimately gives them a decent education. They used sport as the vehicle to do that. They had ambitious goals. They said, we're going to be the best netball team in the country. Easily within 5 years they were, national netball secondary school champions. Then they decided to expand a bit and do the same with rugby. And so we're going to be the best school at rugby. And the girls team won the New Zealand Secondary Schools Girls Championship this year with Christchurch Girls, I think, co-champions. And then they just won the Sevens last year. And they've always been about the best for their rangatahi. Only the best. And that was the kaupapa, that was the why. And the rest followed. The results came. But they started their school with 9 kids. Now the Ministry of Education have just thrown about 30 million at them to build a new kura at Massey University. That can, I think capacity is 300 whara, is it? They can take 300 kids now. And there's a waiting list. Because of the way we do education, the way we do health, the way we do sport. Notice the order. The sport bit comes last, the plus comes first. Education, excellence, health and well-being, as Māori, as rangatahi who can be proud of their cultural identity. And if we need to dangle the sport carrot at you to get you in as well, then, we'll be the best at that too. We'll be the national netball champs, we'll be the national rugby champs as well. The cherry on top.
Cool, thanks Jeremy. So picking up on a couple of caseworks which will probably lead into Holly. So what you have really identified there is this idea that most communities actually know what they want and what they need, and the idea that we often have, people from outside coming in to kind of tell us what we think we need and what we want. So that idea that actually people do know. They often maybe don't have the finances, or maybe they don't have the opportunities to be able to actually realise their aspirations. So I'm just going to now hand over to you, Holly, and if you could talk a little bit about what you see to be some of the key priorities, and then maybe that might link in. So with those key priorities, what does it mean for you to be an accomplice? If you could flesh that out a little more as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm thinking about collaboration here, and it's a word we all use, and it sounds good, and it can be wonderful, but it's always a power dynamic, and I guess I'm in a process of trying to rethink cross-cultural collaboration and my role in some projects there. And the kinds of practice and politics of collaboration. What is good collaboration? And I'm increasingly finding that shutting up and listening is a better form of collaboration, and finding ways to to work behind the scenes to carve out space, to amplify, to the voices of others, actually. And I'm going to draw back here to Paul Whitinui's piece of scholarship that Rochelle was mentioning. On page 12, he says, a key premise underpinning this relationship, talking about collaboration here, is that if white people can name, disrupt, and dismantle their own levels of whiteness, they are perhaps in a better position to take greater responsibility for how they and others like them need to change. One caveat, however, is that we need to ensure white people are not continuing to use their power and privilege to benefit from Indigenous people's struggle as those coming from a high to save us, but rather seen as working alongside us to change the institutional and systemic pillars that reinforce the ongoing power imbalance. And I think that's a really powerful statement there. He continues to say that being an accomplice also means learning to be an activist with and beside Indigenous peoples in the struggle in a variety of different contexts. And I think standing with and beside is really important. And the more I work with my Māori and Pacifica colleagues and PhD students and collaborators, and actually step back and listen to what their experiences are and their struggles are, and then learning from them the best ways that I can be an accomplice, rather than my ideas of what that might be or a good partner here might be, because I can never truly understand what it's like to walk in their shoes. And another example of that is some of my PhD students from the US, African American students, or recently an incredible Muslim American woman who I've worked with in relation with some Sport New Zealand work, and some of the deeply embodied kind of trauma that can come from some of these marginalised kind of positionalities, and the kind of the background emotional support, as well as finding ways to amplify and support their voices, often means finding ways to not think I've got the answers actually, or what is mentoring, what does that background accomplice kind of role look like, and I think I'm on a learning journey here, and I certainly don't have the answers, and I'm just really honoured to be part of this panel, to hear others, and I'll pass it back over to you, Rochelle. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks very much for that, Holly. And I just want to touch on the notion of trauma. So I think sometimes one of the things that can also happen when you're working with Indigenous populations as well is that sometimes people can stay quiet, and we talked a little bit about that yesterday. So being quiet doesn't necessarily mean that you don't want to have an opinion, you don't want to have input. It's just that Jeremy and I talk a little bit about this amongst ourselves, is that, growing up, and, I'm very aware that I'm very Pākehā looking, so I have an element of white privilege, but we often grew up in spaces where we were made to feel ashamed about being Māori. So where I grew up, being Māori meant you were poor, meant that you probably weren't going to really achieve at school. So I was desperate to be Pākehā. And so, sometimes what we need to do is wait patiently also for our Indigenous populations, or our people who might sit at the margins, to actually have a level of confidence to be able to have the energy or the courage to want to participate. And, and I think we also talk a little bit about the idea that in some instances, we're not Māori enough, in other instances, we're too Māori, and so you have because we're colonised, you have this also level of shame about the fact that you can't speak the language, you don't understand your whakapapa in detail, and so for many of us as well, we're deeply interested in being able to have these conversations and move ourselves forward, but actually just that level of trauma or that colonisation or the shame that you carry can be really complicated to have to kind of deal with. And I suppose point I'm making there to link on to Holly before I move on to Justin is that sometimes we need people to be a little bit patient as we also come to terms with who we are or what we're trying to do, because sometimes we actually don't even know ourselves, right, guys? Like we're still trying to make sense of some of that stuff ourselves. Anyway, I'm going to hand on to Justin now, and if you could just talk a little bit about what you see the priorities are and what it means to you to be an accomplice.
Yeah, there's so many exciting things being said that I kind of want to bounce off.
Yeah, bounce away.
And so, I mean, Jeremy, you said something, I scribbled stuff down and I have to try and find where I wrote it. We're often catching up with what we've always done or what we've always known. And for me, that's a really important thing, because a priority for me is to actually, there's a whole lot of knowledge and there's frameworks and there's things that exist that we can engage with and that we need to. And one of those frameworks that it does exist, and Holly brought this word up, collaboration, one of those frameworks that does exist is understanding how we engage with Māori. So we have a framework, in academia and in other spaces, we interchange the words consult, collaborate, partner, willy-nilly. And they actually mean very distinct and different things. And that's really important, and that's been articulated in frameworks for us to actually engage with. There's Pakeha and there's Māori and there's anyone. And I think it's really important that we prioritise understanding the work and the knowledge and the frameworks. And it's landed in frameworks because it's had to make sense to us Pakeha. But it's really important that we actually engage with that and embrace that. The other thing that comes to mind is Jeremy used the term as Māori. And Farah used the term for, by and with. So another framework that comes to mind for me in this space as a priority and as a way forward is something that we have at Sport New Zealand called Te Whiti Rehua, the guiding star, which was developed by our kaiwhakahari of Hiranga Potanga, so our Māori sport providers across the country, many years ago. And it's sat there, and it's used by some, but not used by all. But it's an opportunity, and it's a space that we can use, something we can use to make decisions around investment, around programs, around projects. And what it does, it has at the centre of it, how can we be active as Māori? And that, to me, is a really critical piece, and I encourage people to engage with that piece, because it's relevant across sectors as well. So the last thing I was supposed to talk about was the accomplice part. Yeah. For me, the accomplice part, and Holly sort of said it, sort of two things come to mind. One of them is holding space. So my part of being on that front line as an accomplice is making sure that I'm culturally competent enough to see when the colonisation comes in and the threat arrives. Not so that I can necessarily be the one who has to muscle up, but also so I can hold space and hold back the colonisers, so then I can get the hell out of the way and hold them out of the way so that the goodness can come through and the space is held there for that to happen. And if there's time later, I think a really good example, Farah referred earlier to the development of the Māori Outcomes Framework Te Paki or Ihi Aotearoa. That was a good example of that happened, but I'll shut up now, I've spoken enough.
Yeah, that's cool. Thanks, Justin. So we'll just move to Farah to kind of wind things out, and then we'll go to the floor, and we'll see if there are questions, and if not, we can just also come back to the panel as well. So Farah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to bounce off Justin's idea about holding space. So one of the things I'm very conscious of is that I do have Māori and Pakeha. So I think I'm often seen as an easy option to say we have ticked the box and consulted with Māori in this space. So I have grappled with that for many times, but I think I have come to terms with it as I'm holding space. I'll give you an example. So people ask me, are you jealous about the black firms and how much attention and how great they are now and how much they're getting? And I'm like, no, definitely not. I was right for the time that I was playing. I took it to the next level and we carried on the journey and we kind of like improved it and demanded for it to get to the next stage. So I think about that when I'm in a governance space. I consider myself a tempered radical. I like to be in there and kind of like to chip away. I'm not like a whistle wall, if you know what I mean. The whistle wall in your face and really confronting, and that's cool. I think we need a mixture of tempered radicals and people that shake it up and say nah, or what's happened with Tutor, just kind of like we're just going to completely create our own out here. I think all those options should be there. So really consider who you're approaching to be your designated representative for Indigenous people. Another thing I wanted to raise is sometimes Indigenous rights and aspirations are being subsumed into this bigger thing called diversity and inclusion. So Māori, for instance, just become another ethnic group and constantly having to say, no, we're not just another ethnic group, we're tangata whenua, we're people of this land, we have a tiriti or waitangi that acknowledges that we've got a significant kind of place in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So there's that constant battle of how do we make sure we look after Indigenous rights, but also think about diversity and inclusion. So I think that for me are the two kind of things that I wanted to say. Who are you going to be your kind of representative? And Māori in particular don't make decisions as individuals. We make collective decisions, and that takes time, and that can be frustrating at times. And we will have people in that group that have a sense of shame, and others who stand with confidence in that space. So it's important to have a mixture of perspectives.
Yeah, I just want to actually, before I kind of move back to the panel, Stacey Morrison. So people know Stacey Morrison in New Zealand, really prominent Māori, young woman on TV and things like that with Scotty Morrison, leaders in the Te Reo movement. And she'll often talk about when she hears conversations about diversity in New Zealand and Māori are lumped in with the diversity group, she says it's like being invited to a party at your own house. So it's really important to kind of think about, yes, we're for diversity, but we also, to kind of just be lumped in with everybody else. Party at your own house. Yeah, anyway. So look, I'd really like to go to the floor now and see if there's any questions for our speakers. Otherwise, we'll look to just continue talking. Yeah, just over here. And if you could say who you are, and that would be great. Yeah.
Kia ora tātou, Martin Dion with Karate Aotearoa from Te Whangarei Tāna, Catholic Social Justice Development Agency. Question only for Whānau, but could be open to others, around that decolonisation within New Zealand Rugby Union, like you mentioned it openly here. I just want to get some idea to what extent do you use that word or similar in your talk? Like, do you openly talk, we're decolonising here, or do you talk other words? And I come from someone, writer, journalist, editor, where words matter and the meaning and connotations of it, and decolonisation in our own organisation can be a difficult word to bring.
Yeah. I would say originally when I first got onto the New Zealand Rugby Board, no. I got on as a Māori rep, which was interesting enough. So there's a Māori rep position on the New Zealand Rugby Board, and there was a big push to get a female on the board, so I ticked two. So I was an easy choice, and I had kind of like mana, if you want to call it that, in the rugby space. So I got on there through that kind of avenue. So I think initially I was there kind of representing women. But I kind of did that tempered radical thing and just started to kind of, attack the things that I thought were the easy wins initially. So we changed the constitution so that we could get people onto a Māori rugby board that had a diverse range of skills. I now believe that we have a really, really great Māori rugby board, and we are starting to use the decolonisation, and we're starting to challenge the board that I'm sit on. Now there are two Māori on the New Zealand Rugby Board, so Baby Matthew and myself, and made us both deputy chairs yesterday. So yeah, it's been really interesting seeing how we're developing, and the language we're using is becoming a little bit more challenging. So we are using this word, what can we do to decolonise? It's getting a little bit of a reaction, but we've got enough people around the table now where different voices too helps. Like it's just one voice saying it kind of like switch off. But it's coming from different parts of the organisation now, so we're starting to make changes. I think we're way off though, because we don't have that crown relationship like Sport New Zealand does. You know, it's more about, we need to show you the value of it, you know, for the organisation.
And it is interesting because we definitely understand that it can be complicated for non-Indigenous people because you just get labelled as woke or PC or, you know, those sorts of things. And so it is, you know, how do we just kind of nudge people for, how do we call in and how do we call people out when it's necessary? Yeah, anyway. Uma. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Uma Katari. I used to be a runway radical, but I think I've become a bit more temperate now. And Rochelle, I was always at the wrong party. It wasn't in my home, I was just in the wrong place.
Yeah.
For
Always
so
at
long.
the wrong.
That was just an incredible session, and I've just got a few random thoughts that I'd really like to hear from you. That was fantastic. Thank you. The first is about sort of history, and in England, football used to be called, you know, folk football or mob football, and every single person would go down to the pitch on Saturday. There were no rules. You just had a pig's bladder, you kicked it around the place, and there was that sense of community. And for me, growing up, cricket was our sense of community. That every Sunday we went down and everyone came. You know, the whole kind of Indian diaspora from North London went and played cricket, and it was a way to get away from all that horrible stuff that happens in the week at school and at work and on the street and in transport. And so I think community is incredibly important. I just wondered what you thought in terms of how things have changed historically. If you look, and Farah, you mentioned that a little bit. The second thing is about the role of the individual. So having said that about community, it was so important to me and my family when you switched on the television, you saw Muhammad Ali, or you saw the West Indies cricket team, or you saw Marcus Rashford. So yes, the collective, the community, incredibly important, but I felt the individual just spoke to it. It was so good to see someone who you thought looked like you, they didn't. Muhammad Ali does not look like me. I don't look like him. But it was just so important to see that. So the individual, I think, does have a role to play. And that sort of leads on to the third point that I wanted to make, which is about the politics of sport. Because those individuals played, and Marcus Rashford, I mean, I hate to say this because he's from Manchester United and I'm Manchester City, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. But he got the government to give free school meals to everybody in Britain, all kids in Britain during lockdown. I mean, that's an incredible, Muhammad Ali, what an incredible political role he played. Yeah. So I just wondered whether you could say something about history, something about roles of individuals as you see them and the ways in which they might have interpolated your own kind of experience, and thirdly, just on the politics of sport.
Yeah. So I might just let the panel choose where they could talk to, but I'm not sure. Holly, what about the politics of sport? Well,
don't get me started. I'll be here all day.
You've done work in Gaza, hey? So you know the politics of sport. Yeah.
All the politics of sport happens in our everyday lives. You know, we don't have to go to Gaza to think about the politics of sport, right?
Yeah.
But I actually might even pick up on that last point around the pandemic and the role of sport and physical activity in people's lives, and that's very much what my James Cook fellowship is focused on for this year and next year, and particularly New Zealand women's lives. And so we have a multicultural team working on this project, Māori, Pacifica, Muslim, migrant, and we've done over 100 interviews with New Zealand women from all different diverse backgrounds and socioeconomic contexts. And sport and physical activity has been really important in their lives and in their family lives, in their communities, part of, you know, rebuilding back from the pandemic, but just getting us through everyday challenges. And so I think through the pandemic, people have paid more attention to the importance of moving, physical activity, moving for joy, not necessarily sport, but ticking these boxes of being a good citizen and or beating or winning against another team, actually being together, sharing time together, moving for joy and pleasure in such uncertain and challenging times. And so I think we have people that are, you know, I think we saw that with the World Cup and the incredible athleticism and mana wahine and the team culture. I think New Zealanders celebrated that. It gave us hope for a better future, a better New Zealand. And I think people are looking for hope, for relationships, ways to come together, to reimagine. And I think sport is really powerful in that sense. Yes, it's always, power's always working and politics are always there, but it also has, the possibilities to bring people together, to hope, to dream. And so it's these kinds of tensions which we work in this research space. But, many of us have sporting backgrounds and we're there because we actually love sport, though we see it's really problematic in many ways, but ultimately the doing of the research is to make it better, to make it more accessible to more people, and there's so many different forms of movement, and so sport in that kind of organised, competitive sense is one version, but actually this physical activity and moving for joy and coming together is, I think, more important than ever now and into our uncertain futures.
That's cool. And so, I'll move along the panel now.
I'm going to try and do, if I can, do my best to answer all three questions in one go. That is, historical, political, and also focusing on the individual. So I'm going to talk about some of my PhD research and what I found around the idea of ex-nomination and the ability to name things and not be named, and the power to be able to not be named because you're the norm. And so historically in New Zealand, what we had for 100 years, my PhD research showed that we had this domination of Pākehā people that comprised the New Zealand men's rugby team, the All Blacks. So 90% for 100 years, from the 1880s through the 1980s, on average, 90% and more made up, Pākehā made up All Blacks rugby teams, all right? And it was those one-off individuals who happened to be the non-Pākehā, if they were allowed to. Depends if they went to South Africa. No, they weren't allowed to. Unless, of course, they were an honorary white, then they were allowed to, for example. So, that legacy, that 100-year history created in order to name, and not be named, has led to this, what Farah's articulated, like her experience of coming on to New Zealand Māori Rugby Board and initially not being able to say colonisation, not being able to use that word. That's kind of the politics at play, right? As Farah's nice, tempered way to be an activist, and sometimes the deliberate decision to be an inactivist until the time was right. And in sport, timing is everything. Hopefully I've kind of tried to answer your three questions within that kind of blurb.
Yeah, but I think individuals are absolutely important. So if we think about, sport superstars as role models and being able to bring about change in particular paces, because they can actually really draw on who they are to get momentum, whereas someone else saying that same message probably wouldn't even, someone else could have talked about breakfast or lunches in schools and they could go, food charity. People just need to spend less money on cigarettes and alcohol and then they can afford food, sort of thing. So you're right, there are sometimes when sporting heroes can absolutely make a huge difference to what's happening just because of who they are. So,
And since then, the 90s, noughties and teens, there's been this shift, this change in the ethnic makeup of All Blacks teams, and now also women's rugby teams. And one of those individuals who changed the game in terms of the men's rugby space was called Wayne Smith. And it was probably a strategic decision to get that same guy back in to help rebuild the Black Ferns women's team after the fallout of last year's Northern European tour. So one person can make a huge difference.
And you just look at the way over history, how the haka has been enacted to now how it is enacted. That's kind of good entertainment for people to look at the haka in the 70s versus the haka in the... Anyway,
And the pointy now, eh?
Yeah.
How good.
Yeah. So anyway, Justin and then Farah, you could...
Yeah, the role of an individual actually touches on a really interesting discussion that's been going on for quite a long time between High Performance Sport New Zealand and Sport New Zealand. So they're two different entities, right? We're one group that one part of this looks after high performance sport, and one part where I work looks after activating the community to be more physically active. And depending on what's happening in politics at the time, the flow of money goes into whether or not we're investing in producing superstar athletes, or as to whether we're investing into developing the community support side of things. And one of the arguments that's often presented from the high performance sports side, when the money's going there, is that you've got these athletes that then inspire people to participate in sport. What's been really interesting, and that's what happens when you sit in a room with people who are all about sport. What's been really interesting in this room is that's not come up once. The role of the individual here has been to inspire people in some other shape or form, not to necessarily participate in sport, but to be a role model, to change shifts in society, all those sorts of things, which we often miss when we're just stuck in our sports silo. And I think that's really important. The example I try and give, I've got meetings this afternoon at High Performance Sport at AUT Millennium, and I know I'll use this example this afternoon because I know who I'm meeting with. The example I give is Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. Did that make everyone want to go to the moon, or did it just inspire the world? Because this idea of inspiring the world and changing things because you've done something doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be in that space. So there's huge value that comes from that, and embracing that and grabbing that and actually being targeted about that, I think is a real opportunity.
Yeah, cool. That's
Well, I suppose, I don't know if people know an athlete called Ruby Tui. I mean, Ruby Tui has kind of got iconic status at the moment in women's rugby. She's not even Māori, but she got the whole crowd that was at the final to sing Tūtira Mai Ngā Iwi. You know, she's had a huge impact. And Ruahei Mont, a fluent in Te Reo Māori, a lawyer, just this amazing Māori role model. So, you know, and they've inspired a young girl to say, why don't we have more of the black ferns in the Weet-Bix boxes? You know, so I do think that they can create a wave of activism, and I think that's important, but I do also think you need to think about the welfare of that individual, and when you put all that responsibility on an individual, you've got to look after their welfare, because that's a lot of responsibility. So one of the things I am very conscious of now in my career in governance is that I don't want to be on all boards, you know, like we get no, we'll just put you on all these boards and you'll be the one. It's about sharing it around and suggesting other people for roles and doing that kind of, like, I suppose, mentoring in a way, or just giving other people an opportunity to take that space. And that's really fulfilling for me, and that's when I knew it was time to retire from the Black Ferns, when I was getting more joy watching other people achieving, and I thought, actually, it's time for me to step aside and create that space for someone else. So I think that's more pretty much the same.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that. All questions in the audience again?
It's not, I'll make it quick, it's not exactly a question, it's more something I've experienced that I had a comment on. At the time I was teaching in technical college in Papua New Guinea, and they had a soccer pitch, and anybody who wanted to play could play. You know, either had a shirt or he didn't, so he ended up with 30 aside. And I thought, boy, have these people got it right? This is inclusive. All we need is a bigger pitch. You know, and I just thought, because when I was a weedy little kid at secondary school, you know, the teacher picked the captain picked the team. I never got picked for anything. I said high-board gardening, which made me even shorter because nobody else put their hand up for that. But what I want is, the idea, it struck me that, you know, we've introduced these sports which are very exclusive in an inclusive society. That's why it struck me, you know, to see that, not just once. Because there was, I don't know whether people have heard about, there's a little documentary called Trobriand Cricket, which is from Papua New Guinea. And they've got 50 aside, there's not many centuries. But everybody's included. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. There's some nice writings about Trobriand cricket actually in the anthropology space, so it's quite interesting. So, questions?
Rochelle? Oh,
yes,
Rochelle, could I
yeah.
just jump in?
Yeah,
Sorry.
absolutely.
I just
Yeah.
got a bit of a reflection that I hadn't thought of before, but hearing Justin talking and Farah and talking about, like, I'm thinking about academics doing SDP research, but also those roles and responsibilities in the forms of kind of public intellectualism and governance roles, or working with boards, and the kinds of tensions and that we have to navigate in those different spaces. And I'm thinking back to my work on the International Advisory Board of Skateistan, and it started as a research project with them and presenting some quite critical ideas back to them, and the openness that they had to these kind of critiques of how power's working between their home office in Berlin, where it's an all-white staff, and then their organisational kind of hubs in Afghanistan and Cambodia and South Africa, and they were open to those critiques and they've worked through those, and they're now in a process of really decentralising and working through a process of decolonising the whole organisation. But it's taken, 10 years, and board structure has changed, and we've got more voices on there, and so just really those kinds of that extra work that people do, and I'd love to hear sort of more about, or talk more about those, when academics doing SDP, critical SDP scholarship, navigate those roles and those kind of tensions that you might experience in there, particularly in relation to the process of decolonisation.
Yeah, great. You've just given us a brief for our next paper.
Can I just say too on that ally and accomplice thing, sometimes as an ally or an accomplice you have to step aside. And I think that's the thing, like that's what I'm finding in governance, like everyone's like, oh yeah, we probably do need a bit more diversity, but I'm not giving up my space. And so as an ally or an accomplice, sometimes it requires you to step down in order to allow more diversity, more of an Indigenous perspective in that space.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's just that came up when you were talking.
Yeah. So, question here.
Kia ora, thank you for your presentation. I'm from Karahasa, Aotearoa, New Zealand as well, and I'm whakapapa te Waikato, and Manukaupu as well, Kurangia, Koperangia, tōku mana, ko Waipa, tōku awa, ko Pūrekereki, tōku mana, ko Matthew Papish, tōku ingoa. I just wanted to sort of reflect on my own sort of reconnection with Te Ao Māori. It came first and foremost through hockey. I played quite a lot of hockey at quite a few different levels, and through Hockey New Zealand, and then sort of later in my time playing hockey, I connected with the Māori Hockey Association, and I guess I'm hearing a lot about decolonisation, and where, as Martin said, this is a topic that we discuss in our own workplace. But for me, when I experienced Māori hockey, it was a process of re-indigenisation. That was what it was, and I never came across anything remotely close to decolonisation in Hockey New Zealand. But in Māori hockey, it was entirely indigenising. It was, some of my first experiences actually in those spaces as someone that was raised outside of those spaces. And so I guess there's kind of two things in my head. One is that I sit within an NGO that has a much more international focus, and some of the corridor that we have had within our own organisation is how we might interact with communities to promote development in New Zealand. I guess sport I know through my own experience is a really great vehicle for re-indigenising, particularly those urban Māori who are disconnected and haven't had spaces or places to fit. So I guess I'm just interested to hear what that landscape looks like. I don't really know what sport for development looks like or is, but I'm quite interested in it, particularly for re-indigenisation in New Zealand. I think that's got huge potential.
Just hearing you say that word is, I think, just a bit of brainwave for me, and I think re-indigenising is a really good concept to use that's more at the individual and maybe the group level, like the re-indigenising has to happen in that space. Decolonisation to me is an organisational system change. So, you know, you can start with the individual, and I agree with you, that's a good place to start to create that collective movement, and then the decolonising, or you can go, you know, be a bit more kind of like confronting and go for the decolonisation. But I do think sometimes when you're in a space that's not very welcoming, that is the very first place to start. And it's really comforting to hear that you had that experience, because I had that experience in Māori rugby as well. So Māori rugby, I don't know if people know, but the style of Māori rugby is anything goes, literally, and no kicking, pretty much. It's like run from anywhere on the field and just and use the word flair, but really it's just like be innovative, just try anything, and it's such a free kind of way of expressing yourself. So yeah, I think that's a really good concept, that re-indigenising. Thank you.
Kind of feels key to ours, all I'd say is just think about, you know, yeah, while we're still thinking globally about, from your perspective as an NGO, the important thing is also acting locally too, you know, and bringing it back home.
Alright, so I just saw Sam, did you have one little thing, and then I'll get Jeremy to just close us as well in terms of a shortcut of care, so we can move into the next space and have some kai, if that's okay. Did you have something?
Incredibly ignorant question. How is it different? So you say from Pākehā with hockey to Māori hockey.
Oh, sister.
I don't.
I'm taking you to hockey. You're back when we were in Palmy. I'm going to take you down. We often talk about the coffee cup mums. You don't necessarily see all the coffee cup mums as much at Māori hockey with the puffer jack. Anyway, yeah.
All the rituals and routine, everything's just done differently.
The style of play is different. I think the easiest way for me to explain is that I played sort of 6-7 days a week, and I would be in Wellington my whole time playing hockey, and then we would come together for a weekend, like a long weekend or something like that. And I never really understood why, but I was able to just click into the style of play, the communication style, which was different. And then obviously we were staying on Marae, and there were there's a big Māori hockey community in Rotorua coming out of a particular kura kaupapa, but then there was also a lot of urban Māori who were very disconnected, and so I think that balance and that mix actually really assisted the re-indigenisation process, because there were some of us that were like trying to learn like a haka pohiri in like an hour and then perform it the next day, and there were half of them just taking the absolute piss because they'd done it for like 10 years or 20 years at that point. Does that give you some sort of context?
Kind of the language, the rituals, they're just, I don't know, the food.
So even the game is different.
The style of play is different.
And like haka before a game is normalised in Māori hockey. I played like one game for the under-18 New Zealand side, and I couldn't even, like there was, I think about a handful of us Māori playing, but the time, the space, the cultural capacity, the competency, the intent,
and
none
Sam
of it was there within that New Zealand hockey experience that I had personally.
And one little example of how problematic some of that stuff. This year, down at the New Zealand hockey school competition, some parents in Christchurch made a complaint about a team that went on to win. I think it was the under-15s, because they were speaking te reo. Because they were speaking te reo amongst themselves. So they were a kura team, so they were...
That's the kura from Rotorua.
Yeah, and so parents made a complaint about the fact that this group of boys, that was the boys' competition, were talking in te reo to each other, and it wasn't fair. Notwithstanding the fact that the French team comes here and clearly they speak French when they're playing rugby. So this is the sort of stuff that, and Hockey New Zealand refused to apologise. It was a big deal, wasn't it? And
I've been out of hockey for a couple of years to be
so this is now, this is a young person's team. They're using their own language, and parents are complaining about the fact that it's been spoken. Anyway. Okay. Right. On that note, if there are no more questions, we're a bit over time, so I apologise for that, guys. But thank you so much for really grateful to our speakers, and I'll just get Jeremy to just do a quick little closure of our meeting so we can move into the other stuff.
Okay, Rochelle. Since we're heading to Kai, I'll also tag on a Kai karakia at the end of this one. He kororia, he maunga rongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Kariki o te kai, nau mai e ngā hua o te wā, o te waitai, o te wai Māori, ngā tāne, ngā rongo, ngā haunga, ngā maru. Ko rangi nui e tui honei, ko papa tōnuku e takuto ake nei. Tuturu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna. Hai me hui e, tai ki.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah. Thanks, Holly. Thanks so much, and I'll be in touch. And I hope your little girl gets better and you enjoy your son's birthday. And
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah.
Talk soon.
Cool. Thank you. Very thankful. See you later.
Sam, some people,
No,
say something.